Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first ever Speed Mooting Podcast. My name is John Dove, and I am the founder of the National Speed Mooting Competition, and I'm also a senior Crown Prosecutor with the CPS. This is our first ever podcast, and the idea of this is for you to come along and watch these podcasts, which will have everyone from students all the way through to silks, and we'll cover different topics in every single podcast. Now, given that this is the first ever podcast, I thought that we'd have two very special guests. So tonight we have the 2019 National Speed Mooting Competition champion, Arya Tabrizi, and the 2020 National Speed Mooting Competition champion, Robert Allen. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
So I think we'll start with some introductions. So Arya, would you like to introduce yourself to our guests?
Yeah, I'd love to. So my name's Arya Tabrizi. I started my LLB as a mature student, age 26, MMU. I did the part-time degree. I'm now closer to 31 than I'd care to admit. And I'm doing the bar course at BPP Manchester. As John said, was lucky enough to win the 2019 competition. And I've also secured pupillage at King's Chambers in Manchester, doing PI in Clin Neg.
Thank you. And Robert, would you like to introduce yourself?
So I'm Robert Allen. Just like Arya, I am on the bar course at the BPP Manchester. I also did my GDL there last year, so they're very well represented by both of us. I was very fortunate to win the 2020 Speed Mooting Competition, which was probably just about the last moot, perhaps anywhere in the world, before we all went into lockdown. So very lucky to be in person for that. Since then, as a member of the Middle Temple, I've been elected the mooting officer, and so mooting has become quite a big part of my life.
Thank you. As Robert says, we were very lucky to have that moot just a few weeks before we got locked down.
I was doing the mental maths then, actually, in my head. I was thinking, yeah, that would have been a real borderline one.
It was a close shave.
Yeah.
Very, very close. I think we were about 4 weeks before lockdown, weren't we? Very fortunate, and how different the world was back then.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, given that you've both won mooting competitions, I think it's best that we start by talking about mooting. So would you each like to talk about your mooting experience leading up to today? So we'll start with Arya on this. What is your experience of mooting previously?
Significant, to be honest with you, in the quantity. So we did the first moot I did was part of our tort law course at university. Which sort of maybe 5-7 minutes of delivery. You got sort of tested on etiquette, I think, and content more than anything. That sort of ignited my interest in the bar more generally as well. And from there, I applied for the teams at university. So I was on the teams for 2 years. I did the Essex Court moot, got to like the 4th round, and I did the OUP, got to the 3rd round. A bit bitter about that one, but we won't go into that. And then the year after, was lucky enough to be, got to the final of the internal MMU moot, was in the Supreme Court in front of Lady Hale, which was an absolute honour and perhaps the best advocacy lesson of my entire life. And then obviously we already talked about the speed moot, winning it, which was a highlight. And then also reached the semis of the Two Temple Gardens moot. So I was pretty much mooting from first year onwards, every year, at least one competition.
Very impressive there. Quite the CV that you've got when it comes to mooting, Arya. And Robert, how about yourself?
Really.
Well, I have to admit, I'm much more of a newbie than Arya. My first moot was the speed moot in February. So it was part of my GDL year. Didn't know that I was going to come to law quite soon before taking the GDL. So that was my first go at it. Went pretty well, as I say, so very fortunate about that. And then from there, it's just been building up experience. Recently, I've been invited to join as part of the William Viss Moot competition for 2021 for the Middle Temple. So that's quite a long team process, trying to gather all the research at the moment for the memorandums. But yes, I'm quite new to mooting in that respect. It's only really since February that all of this has started to happen. So hopefully testament that you can get into it quite quickly and build up some experience.
That's great to hear, actually, because when I started the speed mooting competition, the idea was that it should be open to experienced mooters and newer mooters alike. And the fact that the two of you, who are polar opposites when it comes to your experience, have both won the competition 1 year after the next, really speaks volumes that this competition is open to absolutely anyone, and anybody has a chance regardless of how experienced you are. And this leads me on to the next question, which is, how do you prepare for mooting competitions? So I'll start with you, Robert, given that you've got slightly less experience when it comes to mooting.
Well, it so depends on the style of the competition. Something like the speed moot is obviously very different to a longer team moot where there's plenty of preparation to be done, lots of reading in advance. So it depends on what sort of materials there are in front of you. I remember, just as an example, with the speed moot again back in February, that was a case of staying up until the early or even the mid hours of the morning. I think it was 3 o'clock, just reading the papers and making sure that I knew exactly what the facts were and what was going to be relevant. It doesn't all need to go into your skeleton argument or into your submissions. You don't need to plan to say everything, but being able to know your stuff it cannot be understated. It will be said by everybody, but just knowing the facts is crucial. So reading those papers again and again and just being comfortable with whatever amount of information you're having to deal with is the only way around it. There's no shortcuts to this.
Excellent. And how about you, Arya? How do you prepare for a moot?
I mean, I'd agree with everything that Rob's just said. To borrow his phrase, being comfortable with your papers is key, and it really is being comfortable. It's not going over them once or twice, or sort of rote learning them. It's really internalizing, what's the case about, and what's the thrust of the main argument. And I think if you do that, if you get to that fairly quickly, I'm of the belief that the rest kind of falls into place a little bit. And everyone will differ and have different styles then. But if you really internalize what the facts are about, what's the complaint, and what's the thrust of the legal argument, then I think you're 90% of the way there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Preparation is key. And when you know the case inside and out, it really helps you when you come to present that moot in court. And there really is no alternative for practice. You have to practice. And by that, it's not really about having a speech. You can use your skeleton arguments as the foundation for what you're going to say. But as long as you practice those submissions a few times, then you should be well prepared. And that brings me on to the next point, really, because one of the most important parts of a moot is judicial intervention. So you can prepare for your submissions, but you don't really know what questions are going to come. Or if you prepare for the moot well, you shouldn't have a good idea of where the weaknesses lie with your argument. Yeah. So how do you deal with judicial intervention? I'll start with Arya.
Well, I love judicial intervention. A lot of people don't seem to. But again, I think if you're comfortable with your papers, the more comfortable you are, the more comfortable you are with judicial intervention. I think the best piece of advice I ever got in relation to that was quite early on from our mooting tutor at uni. And he said, look, you've got to treat this as a dialogue with the judge. You've got to go in with that mindset already before they've even asked you a question. In a way, it's kind of like if you were sat here at the desk discussing a legal problem with me, how would you approach it? In that sense, it'd be back and forth, and you wouldn't be put off by that because that's what you want. You want back and forth. There's a problem, and the two of you together are trying to figure out what the problem is. The only slight difference is you're trying to steer the judge into thinking that it is what you want him to think it is. So I think if you approach it in that way, and again, it's like you said before, don't have a speech. It's the worst thing you can do, because then it throws you off completely. But if you approach it as a dialogue and you're just trying to work out the answer together, then suddenly I don't think judicial intervention is anywhere near as scary.
No, I agree. And Robert, how about you? How do you deal with judicial intervention?
Well, it's difficult, isn't it? I think the main thing to try and remember is to help the judge. It's very tempting to see the judge, particularly when you're nervous, you're feeling intimidated by them. Perhaps they're looking a bit grumpy. They're staring at you either through a screen or across.
Always looking grumpy.
Yeah.
Yes. Steely-eyed.
But try the very best you can to help them. If they're asking you a question, it's an easy indicator of what their concern is with what you're saying. They might be hinting at something that they're particularly feeling is going to decide this case. So go straight to it. Don't try and move away from it. Don't take the sort of dodgy politician's view of trying to avoid the question at all costs and stick to your script. If you do have some submissions prepared, take the judge to the point in those submissions that you can then answer the question. I think one thing which I've seen a little bit, which doesn't go down well, is if you say, well, my lord, I'm coming to that in 5 minutes, so if your lordship's patient, we'll get there, and then just bat it away. It's not going to work. You've got to be prepared, be flexible, move straight to that point, say something like, I wasn't going to come to that yet, but I will now. I'll address that point quickly, and then try and help the judge. Don't see them as your enemy, even if they might be.
Absolutely. As you say, I think you hit the nail on the head there. If the judge is asking you a question, that's what their real concern is. That's what they want to know about. So deal with it straight away. If you try and bat it off, then it's never going to be successful at all. And one other thing that we came to there was skeleton arguments. So do you have any pointers for students when it comes to skeleton arguments at all? Start with Robert on this question.
Well, there's that old tip about trying to write your skeleton argument and deliver your submissions as your dream judgment. I think that's always a good way of starting the approach, just to try and imagine what is it that you want the judge to say in their concluding remarks, and then try and write it in that sort of a format. Keep things simple. Don't get too bogged down, I would say, in an academic approach of quoting every case in full and explaining everything in full. You see in practice a lot of the time that skeleton arguments at their best are quite brief. But of course, the key is, as we said earlier, that you know your facts behind that, so that if you are asked that detailed question on a particular point or a particular case, you're able to go to. But just try and keep it quite simple without being simplistic, if that makes sense.
Good advice there. And Arya, how about yourself? Anything on skeleton arguments?
I think Rob covered it really. I mean, succinctness and simplicity are the buzzwords when it comes to a skeleton. There's no doubt about that. I mean, make sure you cover everything, but not in too much detail. So you hit everything, every aspect of law and every aspect of fact that's important to you. So it's all there, skeletally, as it were. But at the same time, don't sort of drift into so much detail that it takes away from your oral submissions, and you've got nothing left to say.
Yeah, precisely. Effectively, the skeleton argument is the bones, and your oral submissions are the flesh that go on the bones in reality, and that's the best way to think about it.
And I would just say, to add on to that, apply the test and start out with the test. And I'm sure you've been told the same thing, and from P, in that make sure you set out what that test is from the very start, so that it's very clear for you as well as anyone else exactly what you're trying to achieve out of those submissions. Don't get too lost in making points which might relate in some way. Stick to the test and then apply each of your various submissions to that test.
Yes, good advice there. And just one final point on mooting before we move on. Any advice for any students at all? Obviously, you've both been very successful in mooting, so do you have any sort of takeaway points for students when it comes to mooting? So I'll start with Arya on this question.
Well, I mean, my main advice would be do it. I think, and don't just do it once, because unless you're an absolute natural like Rob over there, you will need to sort of ease into it. You will be it's a terrifying thing the first time you do it. And I'm sure Rob was no less terrified, even though he was very good at it. It's still, you still get nervous to this day when you're doing submission advocacy. It's not easy to put yourself out there on a limb and convince someone that's usually, even in practice, is going to be far more senior and well-versed than you. So I just think do it often, build confidence, and know that it gets more fluent the more you do it.
Excellent. And Robert, any advice when it comes to mooting?
Exactly the same, really. Just throw yourself in there. Don't be afraid. It's always, you're always going to be nervous, but that first time you do it is going to be the hardest, I think, in that you've just got to try and break that barrier. And once you've seen it, once you've felt it, the experience of having those interventions coming towards you, it's always going to be tricky, but you learn how to deal with that slightly, and you learn that it is possible to get through it and survive, even if you don't always win. You know, there's you live to fight another day, and I think starting with that first moot is the critical thing. If you're not feeling confident, find a way of getting into it, and there are obviously opportunities with speed mooting, I think perhaps being number one for that. Find a way in which allows you to just go for it yourself and give it a go. What's the worst that can happen?
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the big things about speed mooting. You don't have to wait for your university to put you forward or be picked. You've got that opportunity to just enter the competition of your own free will. And I'm sure that's something that both of you liked about that competition, and that freedom to go for it. So it gives absolutely anyone the chance to try out speed mooting.
I think that, and also just to add with the speed moot, I mean, unless you are unlucky and you get knocked out in the first round, in which case you're always putting on sort of extra events for the students, so it's worth their while. But the likelihood is you'll probably get through 2-3 rounds, and you've then been able to do the same moot 2-3 times in a row under pressured conditions. So that kind of accelerates your experience in quite a short amount of time. So I think it's a perfect one. If you're going to do one, not just saying this because it's your podcast, John.
No,
if you're going to do one, the bang for your buck choice really would be the NSM, definitely.
Yeah, it's perfect because, as you say, in 3 rounds, and 3 rounds could take you 90 minutes. You've done the equivalent of what could take you 3 months to try 3 different mooting competitions.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, quick fire round. I'm sure you've both been to sort of major competitions. What do you prefer, senior or junior council? Which role do you prefer?
I mean, look,
tough questions.
I don't think it makes a difference, to be honest with you, mooting. It really doesn't. The temptation is to say senior council. The more you do, the more I used to say, look, to my partner, whoever I was with, if it was that kind of competition, you choose your ground, because I wanted them to be as comfortable as possible with whatever they were doing, and then I'll argue anything. And I just used to prefer that method going around it. But you don't, I mean, sometimes you get slightly less time if you're junior counsel, but you often then get a right of reply, because it's normally junior appellant that gets like in Essex court. So I think it's as broad as it is long in terms of mooting. Yeah,
certainly. How about you, Robert? Anything on that point?
Well, I haven't done it yet, so you're going to have to ask me that question.
Oh, right, okay.
But yeah, I think it's interesting to hear that. Actually, it must depend so much on the particular moot and where each party feels. I've got some experience in the preparation now for team moots, and you'll often meet on different areas of the research, and you grow as a team in those particular areas. So I think you've just got to find where you're most comfortable. And obviously, in a team scenario, going away from the individual contest, it's about communicating your particular, where you're feeling particularly confident, where you're feeling a little bit more cautious, and just trying to be willing to work as a team and not let individuals cause trouble there. It's just trying to gel as a team and support each other.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest parts of 2-on-2 moots, is that you have got that teamwork element. You need to divide it equally and ensure that you're both sort of doing the work there. The good thing with the speed moot is that everybody's an individual. You're responsible for your own work there. So you fall on your own sword effectively. Sometimes with moot, you might find that the law is for you. You might find the law is against you. And of course, you're generally not judged on the law itself. You're judged on how well you argue the law. What do you prefer? Do you prefer having the law in your favour and really putting the points home? Or do you prefer having it against you, so you've got more that you can distinguish, or you've got to try and distinguish the law effectively? Which scenario do you prefer there?
Well, David over Goliath, you've got to say. Always favour the underdog. And I think both are fun in a way, actually. And I'm trying not to avoid answering the question, but the nice thing about doing something like the speed moot is you experience both sides of the argument. Yeah. And you, even if there is one side which is becoming more clearly the more plausible, you can even start to mess around in your own mind which side you're actually persuaded by. When you hear some very good submissions from your learned friends out there, you think, actually, am I right on that or not? So it's, I think, underdog, but often that can change in the course of a moot.
Certainly. Any thoughts on that, Arya?
Yeah, I think if I had, I tend to agree with what Rob said as well, but I think if I had to choose, and it wasn't a format like the NSM where you're sort of switching, I actually think in a moot, it's easier to score points if the law's against you.
Yeah.
Because unless it's really against you to the point where you can't make any credible points, which would be unusual. That's probably a fairly poorly written moot if that's the case. But you can really stand out by being creative, I think. Yeah. Whereas if the law's for you, you kind of have to not put a foot wrong. And I was always slightly better at being maybe a little bit out there and creative than I was at actually being sort of particularly flawless. I wasn't very good at that at all. I made many mistakes, but maybe come up with that one little sort of analogy or nugget that would make the judge think, okay, I can kind of see what he's doing. He's going to lose on the law still, but at least it was a decent attempt. So I don't think you certainly shouldn't be worried if the law's against you in a moot.
No, I think I would agree. And I used to find it more fun, particularly when the law was against me, because you'll trawl through the case law, you'll be looking through the comments and looking for any obiter comments that you can throw in that maybe support your argument, and looking for analogies as well. So I think I found that a little bit more fun.
Mining for gold, I used to call it.
Say again?
Mining for gold.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things with the National Speed Moot is we always try and make the problems as equal as possible. So we try and make them about 50-50 on the law. So that doesn't really become an issue. Okay, I think we've covered most things about mooting there, unless anyone's got any other comments about mooting.
No, just do it. Yeah. Like we said before, I think.
Absolutely agree. If you want to go into this profession and become a solicitor, advocate, or a barrister, you've got to show that you've got that advocacy experience and that you're actually interested in. The best way you can do it is by mooting.
Definitely.
Okay. Final thing is, obviously you've both been very successful throughout your time at university. Any words of wisdom for any students, maybe who are in first, second year, looking to progress through? Any advice for what they should be doing while at university?
I'll let Rob go first on this one.
Yeah.
I think of some words of wisdom.
That's why I let you go first.
I think one thing which it's obviously it so depends on your style of learning. One thing that I found helpful, and this may be helpful to others who aren't already doing it, is flashcards. There's plenty of apps that you can get now where you can make flashcards. It's just trying to find creative ways to get, particularly the facts of cases, ingrained in your mind, and doing it in different ways than just trying to read from a book or regurgitate it. Another thing which maybe it's a little bit more unique to someone as arcane as I am, but I find I can't really type things that much and learn them. It has to be handwritten notes. So there's nothing wrong with having a big pile of handwritten notes and just going through those again and again, just finding what works for you, but doing different things than just reading or just typing would be my approach to it.
Certainly. And Arya, any last words of wisdom?
I definitely agree with that last point. That's really important. Don't just read things. Whatever mechanism works for you, but find one that consolidates it in your mind. You have to. That's why mooting is great, right? Because you use it, and therefore you internalize it. And probably the only thing I'd add would be, even if you're not doing mooting, don't be afraid of reading judgments. So surprising how many law students seem to be like, have you read the judgment? And it's like a seminal one, like Caparo or something now. Don't just take it from textbooks, because they are someone's edited version of that judgment. And at the end of the day, whether it's academia or any form of practice, you're going to have to get used to reading judgments. And it is a particular skill, I think. Especially on the longer judgments, to sort of be able to glance and skim through and get to the meat of it. So just really embrace reading the case law.
Great advice there from both of you. Well, I think that brings us up towards the end of the first ever podcast. I would like to thank both of you for your time tonight. And if you've enjoyed these podcasts, hopefully we should have more coming soon. So keep an eye out for those. For anyone who's interested in mooting, here at Speed Mooting, we run regular competitions, both in terms of speed moots and other forms of advocacy as well. So check out our website, join our mailing list on the website, and keep your eyes out for lots of competitions throughout 2021. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks, John.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. And good luck to everybody